An important part of animation in Flash is understanding frames and keyframes. If you're following along, I'm working in o3_frames_keyframes.fla in the Chapter 4 folder in the Exercise Files folder. Let's talk about the difference between frames and keyframes. Frames are points in time in your animation. In the timeline in Flash, frames have a gray background. The area in the timeline from frame 1 to frame 10, both in the robot layer and the background layer, are all frames. They all represent points in time or points in the animation. Now, the difference between regular frames and keyframes is that keyframes are where you, the designer of the Flash content, specify exactly what the art will look like on a particular frame. Frames that aren't keyframes are dependent on the art on the last keyframe. For example, the first frame of the background layer is a keyframe. Now, the reason I can tell that it's a keyframe is because there's a black dot with a gray background. The rest of the frames of the background layer are not keyframes, but merely frames. Frames that aren't keyframes simply have a gray background. And what I'm going to do now is hide the robot layer. In the robot layer, there's a dot on the left and one on the right. The one on the left will hide a layer. So I'm going to hide the robot layer so I can't see it. So now we're just looking at the background layer. If I scrub the playhead by clicking the playhead and dragging it from left to right, I can see that the art on the stage never changes. So we have one keyframe where we specify what the art will look like. The rest of the frames on the background layer aren't keyframes. And so we never change the art or tell Flash exactly what the art will look like on those frames. Because we didn't do that, Flash assumes that the art is going to stay the same since the last keyframe. Now, you may have noticed on the background layer that the last frame has a gray background and a white box. In other words, it's the last regular frame that's dependent on the previous keyframe. The robot layer only has keyframes. Now what I'm going to do is show the robot layer by clicking in the red X in the robot layer. Then I'm going to click and drag the playhead to preview the animation, one frame at a time. Notice that on each frame, the art changes. The robot moves. So as I go to frame 3, the robot moves. Frame 4, the robot moves. 5, and so on. So by using keyframes, you specify exactly what the art will look like at a specific point in time. Now that you know what frames and keyframes are, let's start creating animations.